You walk up to a counter, you order a coffee. The person behind the counter turns a screen around and on it are four buttons: 18%, 20%, 25%, and a button that says custom, which everyone knows is the polite way of saying zero, but with extra steps. And there are three people in line behind you, and the employee is standing right there, making eye contact. So you hit 20% for a coffee that someone poured from a machine while you stood there. And as you walk away slightly annoyed and slightly manipulated, you find yourself doing what everyone does in this situation. You wonder how we got here. You wonder when pouring a coffee became a tippable event. You wonder why a touch screen at a self-checkout kiosk at an airport asked you for a gratuity when the only human involved in the transaction was you. And then you wonder something darker. Where is all this money actually going? Because the tipping system in America has expanded so far beyond its original purpose, infiltrated so many industries it was never designed for, and been so thoroughly engineered by the businesses deploying it that the answer to that question is a lot more complicated and a lot more uncomfortable than most people realize. Because tipping in America was never really about rewarding good service. It was about shifting a labor cost from the employer onto the customer. And the people who figured out how to weaponize that shift have made an extraordinary amount of money doing it. Let's start at the beginning, because tipping has a history that most people don't know, and that history explains a lot about why the system works the way it does today. Tipping as a practice originated in Europe, specifically in England, in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a discretionary payment made to service workers as a bonus on top of their regular wages. The key word being discretionary. It was optional, it was extra, it was a reward for exceptional service, not an expected component of a worker's baseline income. When tipping arrived in America in the late 1800s, it was actually controversial. There were genuine public debates about whether tipping was ethical, whether it created an undemocratic class dynamic, whether it was demeaning to workers to have their income depend on the whims of customers. Several states actually passed laws attempting to ban tipping in the early 1900s. The practice was seen as un-American, a holdover from the European class system that the country had supposedly left behind. Those laws didn't stick, and the reason they didn't stick has everything to do with one specific industry, the railroad industry. Because railroad companies, which employed large numbers of black workers in service roles following the Civil War, realized that if passengers tipped those workers directly, the company didn't have to pay them a living wage. The tip became a subsidy, a way to provide service without paying for it. And that logic that employers could transfer their labor costs onto customers through the social pressure of tipping proved so financially attractive that it spread everywhere. Which brings us to the mechanism that makes the whole thing run, the tipped minimum wage. In the United States, the federal tipped minimum wage is $2.13 per hour. That number has not changed since 1991. For over 30 years, the federal government has allowed employers in the hospitality industry to pay tipped workers $2.13 an hour on the assumption that tips will make up the difference to at least the regular minimum wage. If they don't, the employer is technically required to make up the shortfall. In practice, enforcement of that requirement is inconsistent at best. What this means in practical terms is that the American restaurant industry has built its entire labor model around the assumption that customers will subsidize its payroll. The menu prices you see do not reflect the true cost of the labor required to serve you. That cost has been externalized onto you in the form of a social obligation that has been so thoroughly normalized over so many decades that refusing to participate makes you the problem, not the system that created it. And restaurant owners have been among the most aggressive lobbyists against any change to the tipped minimum wage, because the current system is extraordinarily profitable for them. Every dollar a customer tips a server is a dollar the restaurant didn't have to put in the labor budget. The pressure, the guilt, the social contract of tipping, it's all free marketing for a subsidy the industry has been collecting for over a century. But here's where the story gets more interesting. Because the restaurant industry's exploitation of the tipping system is at least somewhat understandable given its historical roots. What's happened over the last decade is something different entirely. The iPad point-of-sale system changed everything. When Square, Toast, and other tablet-based payment platforms started replacing traditional cash registers in the early 2000s, they came with a feature that quickly became standard: the tip prompt. And what was once a physical tip jar on a counter, something you could easily ignore without social consequence, became a full-screen request that appears at the moment of payment, in front of the employee, with preset percentages and a custom option that requires deliberate action to select. The result was predictable. Tipping rates in counter service establishments, places that had historically not been tipping environments at all, skyrocketed. Coffee shops, fast casual restaurants, bakeries, juice bars, food trucks, and eventually nail salons, tattoo parlors, and retail stores all started deploying tip prompts. And customers, caught off guard and unwilling to look cheap in front of a stranger, started tipping. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Those payment platforms charge merchants a percentage of every transaction. When a tip is included in the transaction, the platform takes a cut of that too. Square, Toast, and similar platforms typically charge between 2 and 3.5% of the total transaction, including the tip, which means every time you add 20% to your coffee order, the payment processor takes a percentage of your generosity as their fee. The tip prompt wasn't added to payment systems out of concern for workers. It was added because it increases transaction values, and higher transaction values mean higher processing fees. The payment platforms are profiting directly from the social pressure they engineered into the checkout experience. And then there's the question of where the tips actually go once they're collected, because the answer varies more than most people realize, and the variance is not always in the worker's favor. In traditional full-service restaurants, tips generally go to the server, sometimes with a portion shared, to support staff through a practice called tip pooling. But tip pooling rules vary by state and by establishment, and there have been numerous legal cases involving employers illegally taking portions of tip pools or including management in distributions that should have gone entirely to hourly workers. In counter-service and quick-service environments, tip distribution is even more inconsistent. Some establishments distribute tips equally among all staff. Some keep a portion for administrative costs. And in some cases, particularly in larger corporate chains, tips collected digitally are subject to processing fees before workers receive them, meaning the employee gets less than what the customer intended to give. There have also been documented cases of employers using tips to offset other compensation, effectively making tips a substitution for wages rather than a supplement to them, which is precisely the dynamic that tipping critics have always argued the system enables, and that employees have the least power to push back against. And then there's the psychological architecture of the modern tip prompt, because the people who designed these systems understood human behavior well enough to engineer outcomes deliberately. The default tip amounts on most payment terminals start at 18% and go up, not down. The lowest preset is rarely below 15%, and many systems now default to 20, 22, or 25% as the middle option. The custom button, the one that lets you enter your own amount or select zero, requires an extra tap. It's slightly harder to find. On some systems, it's labeled in smaller text. On others, it comes after a confirmation screen. None of this is accidental. It is the same category of dark pattern design used by subscription services to make cancellation difficult, default to the profitable outcome, and make the alternative require conscious effort. Studies on tip prompt design consistently show that higher default amounts produce higher average tips, not because customers decided to be more generous, but because the path of least resistance leads to the higher number. You are not freely choosing to tip 22%. You are accepting the default because accepting the default is easier than doing anything else. And the companies that built these systems know exactly what they're doing. So, what is the actual solution here? Because the tipping debate tends to collapse into two camps: people who think tipping should be abolished entirely, and people who think that abolishing it would hurt the workers who depend on it. And both camps have a point. The workers are real. The income dependency is real. In states with a tipped minimum wage, many servers and bartenders earn the majority of their income from tips and would face genuine financial hardship if the system disappeared overnight without a corresponding increase in base wages. The problem isn't the workers. The problem is an industry structure that has made workers dependent on customer charity as a substitute for employer responsibility. The countries that have moved away from tipping, most of Europe, Australia, Japan, have done so by building labor costs into menu prices and paying workers a living wage from the employer's budget rather than the customer's conscience. Restaurant prices are higher in those markets, but the total cost to the customer, including a tip, is often comparable or lower, and workers have stable, predictable income that doesn't depend on the mood of the table. In America, several restaurant groups have experimented with no tipping models, adding a service charge to bills and distributing it as part of employee wages. The results have been mixed. Some customers resist the loss of control, some workers resist the loss of high-earning nights, and some restaurants have quietly reversed the policy after seeing customer resistance affect their reviews. The system is embedded deeply enough that changing it is genuinely hard, but understanding it is the first step. Because the next time a screen asks you to tip 25% for a transaction that required no service, you're allowed to know that the guilt you feel was engineered by a payment processing company that takes a cut of whatever you enter. And you're allowed to make a different choice. The tip jar used to be optional. Someone decided to make it a full-screen prompt with a countdown timer, and that someone wasn't doing it for the workers.